What's going on, everyone? It's Adrian from Draft Time, and welcome to another picks video. Now, in this video, I'm going to go over the main FanDuel slate for tonight. We got a nice little five-game slate, and there's also some day games today for the MLK holiday, but I'm not going to go over those games. I'm just going to go over the main FanDuel slate. So, before I get into the slate, I want to give a little bit of clarification about what I'm doing in these videos. When I'm breaking down all these games and all of these players, I'm doing it from a GPP perspective. So if I say, maybe I'm going to fade this guy or maybe I'm going to lock in that guy, I'm talking about doing that for GPPs. Now, when it comes to my cash lineups, I don't really do that much research or thinking for my cash lineups. Basically, half of my cash lineups I do with the number one lineup using the default projections. And then the other half of my cash lineups, I'll put 100% weight on this PRJ2 right here, which is our ownership adjusted projections for cash. So that's how I approach my cash lineups. So in this video, everything that I'm going over is for GPPs. So as far as tonight's slate, there's not a whole lot of value so far, but there are some guys who are questionable. So that could change later on if any of these questionable guys end up missing their games tonight. So you got Shea Gilgeous-Alexander, who's questionable. If he ends up missing the game, that's obviously huge for a bunch of the Thunder players. LeBron James is questionable, but he's always questionable. He's probably going to end up playing. Yeah, Jaylen Brown and Jimmy Butler, who are both questionable. And then you got Max Strus, who's questionable. So a lot could change between now and the start of tonight. Now, as far as guys who are out, there's not a whole lot of new players who are out tonight. All these guys have been out for a while now, with the exception of Jaime Jaquez. He just got injured last night, which I had him in 100% of my lineups last night, and he was on pace to give me 50, and he got hurt after the first half, which ended up screwing me. But anyways, I digress. Let's go ahead and take a look at the top value plays for the night. And the number one value pick is going to be LeBron James at $9,800, projected to score 50.19. He's going against the Oklahoma City Thunder, who have a really bad defense and they play at a really fast pace. So that's why you're seeing LeBron James projected to be 54.22% owned. But that might actually be a little bit lower since he's officially tagged as questionable, and a lot of times that scares guys. Even though LeBron James is always questionable and he always ends up playing. But yeah, that's the top value play for tonight, and that's how you know there's not a whole lot of value tonight. He's the only guy with a value over 5. Now, as far as my top sleeper pick, that's going to be Rui Hachimura for the Lakers. He's only $4,500, and we only have him projected for 17.68 and 3.63% ownership. So he should be pretty low owned because this is only his second game back. And in his first game back, he only played 18 minutes. So I'm hoping and I'm thinking that they might ramp up his minutes to maybe like 23 to 26 minutes in his second game back. And he was pretty productive in the low minutes that he had last game. So if he ends up playing, 25 minutes and gives you 30 at $4,500, that could break the slate tonight. So I really like Rui Hachimura as a sleeper pick tonight. But anyways, let's go ahead and get into all of the games. And let's take a look at the first game. You got Chicago at Cleveland. Now, as far as Chicago and Cleveland, these are both two really good defenses. You got Chicago, they allow the 12th fewest points per game, and they play at the third slowest pace. And then you got Cleveland, they play at the eighth slowest pace, and they allow the fourth fewest points per game. So this could very well be a low scoring, slow paced game. Now, for Chicago, you got pretty much everyone healthy with the exception of Patrick Williams, who's questionable. Whether or not he plays, I don't think it'll make that big of an impact. Now, I'm not going to go crazy with any Chicago players, to be honest. I mean, there's a lot of mouths to feed on this team, and they're going against a pretty solid defense in Cleveland. Uh, Maybe I'll do one DeMar DeRozan. Maybe I'll do one Levine. Maybe I'll do one Vucevic just in case one of those three guys go off. But I'm not really going crazy with anyone on this team. Now, for Cleveland, like I mentioned earlier, you got Max Strus, who's questionable. Now, look for the possibility of maybe potentially adding Sam Merrill if Max Strus ends up missing the game. The last game, Max Strus got injured. Sam Merrill played 31.85 minutes, and he actually had a better game the game before that. He finished with 26.1 fantasy points in just 22 minutes. So I think there's pretty good value for him. He's averaging 22.58 over his last 5, and that's even with Strus in most of those games. So expect his projection to shoot up to like the mid 20s without Max Strus. But then his ownership obviously is going to go up as well. Probably will be in the 20 to 30% range as far as ownership. So as far as Donovan Mitchell, he's coming off a monster game, 73.4 fantasy points. He's averaging 49 over his last 10 games. He has one, two, three, four, five out of his last 10 games. He's gone over 50 fantasy points. So I would consider some Donovan Mitchell. He could end up being the top scorer for the whole slate tonight, especially if Shea Gilgeous-Alexander ends up missing the slate. So definitely got to consider some Donovan Mitchell. Jared Allen as well. He's on a pretty good stretch right now too. He's averaging 47 over his last 10 games. He scored 50 plus in one, two, three, four, five. So at five out of the last 10 games as well. So you definitely got to consider some Jared Allen, especially since there's not a whole lot of value at that center spot. You might want to lock him into that center position. And the way you do that is you come over here to the lock button and then you choose center. Mainly because there's not a whole lot of value at center tonight. Karis LeVert at $7,300. I think he's priced right. I mean, he's averaging 36 over his last 5 games. And if there's no Struce, um, you could expect his projection to go up from it's right now it's at 29. Expect that to go up to like maybe like 32 or so. But I'd still think that's not enough for $7,300. Maybe you lock him into one or two lineups um, just in case he gives you another 40 plus game, which he's done a few times over the last 10 games. But I'm not going crazy with LeVert, especially against this good Chicago defense. Max Strus, if he does play, I think 6,400. It's too expensive. He plays pretty big minutes, but he's just not that productive in the minutes that he plays. And then you got Isaac Okoro, $5,100. I think that's too expensive for him, even without Max Strus. Even in games that he does play big minutes, he doesn't put up that many fantasy points. So I don't think he has that high of a ceiling at $5,100. But Sam Merrill, like I mentioned earlier, I think he does have a high ceiling at 4,500 because he's going to play pretty big minutes with no Max Strus if Max Strus ends up missing the game. And then no one else really worth picking up on the Cavs. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the next game. You got Boston at Toronto. And for Boston, they allowed the seventh fewest points per game, and they play at a pretty average pace. And then you got Toronto. They allow the 10th most points per game, and they've been really bad defensively since the trade. And they also play at an average pace. So the big news for the Celtics is you got Jaylen Brown, who's questionable. So if he does end up missing the game, that's going to open up a lot of things for a lot more of these Celtics players, especially someone like a Peyton Pritchard. Um, but anyways, let's go ahead and go through these players here on the Celtics. You got Jason Tatum. He's $10,000. He's coming off an abysmal game. Well, actually, 2 games ago against Milwaukee, he only finished with 11.7 points. That was a blowout. Um, but besides that, he's on a pretty good stretch. So I think it's definitely worth considering Tatum in case he gives you, 55 plus, which he's capable of doing. And if Jaylen Brown ends up missing the game, then you definitely got to consider some Tatum. Jaylen Brown, if he does end up playing, I think 8,500 is kind of expensive for him. Maybe lock him into one or two just in case he gives you a 50-point game, which he's capable of doing. But I'm not going crazy with Jaylen Brown. Then you got Kristaps Porzingis. At $8,600. I think he's been very hit or miss. He's had some 50-point games, but then he's also had, a 19-point game, an 11-point game, a 30-point game, and that's just not going to cut it at $8,600. So I'm only going to lock him into maybe one or two lineups just in case he gives you, one of those 50-point games. If Jaylen Brown ends up missing the game, that'll give him a slight boost. Maybe he'll go from like 37 to like 39, 40. But even then, he's not going to be that valuable. You got Derek White, who's been trending down recently. He's averaging just 19.8 over his last 5 games. So maybe only consider him if Jaylen Brown ends up missing the game. Otherwise, I don't think he's worth picking it up at $7,500. Now, Drew Holiday, on the other hand, I think he is worth picking up if there is no Jaylen Brown at under $7,000. I think that's pretty good value for him. In the 2 games that Jaylen Brown did not play this season, Drew Holiday actually averages 40 points per game because he's kind of that secondary scorer with no Jaylen Brown. Then you got Horford. No, he's too expensive. Peyton Pritchard and Hauser, maybe only consider them if Jaylen Brown ends up missing the game. Otherwise, I don't think they're worth it. So let's go ahead and take a look at Toronto. So for Toronto, they're still without Jakob Pertl. Um, I like Barnes and Siakam in the 8,000s, especially on a slate like tonight where there's not a whole lot of value. I would consider picking up one and excluding the other. So try different combinations of them. You got Emmanuel Quickly, who had a bad game. It was his first bad game since getting traded to the Raptors. At $7,400, I'm not crazy about that price for him. Maybe he gives you 40 like he did the game before that. Otherwise, I don't really think he's worth it. So I'm not going to go crazy with quickly. But you got RJ Barrett at $6,500. I do think there's a lot of upside to him. He was on a nice little stretch before last game. So I like that value at $6,500. And so he's probably going to get picked up by the optimizers. So maybe you consider fading him in some of those. Otherwise, I like RJ Barrett. And then you got Dennis Schroeder at $5,700. I think that's too expensive for him. He hasn't been doing much since the Emmanuel Quickly and RJ Barrett trade. So I'm not going to do any Dennis Schroeder. And then you got Thaddeus Young, who is only $4,100. So he's probably going to get picked up by the optimizer. He's projected to score 19 fantasy points with no Jakob Pertl. But the play that I like is fading Thaddeus Young for Jonte Porter, who's coming off a monster game last game, 37.2 fantasy points. And actually, the game before that, I talked about fading Boucher, who a lot of people had forgetting big minutes with no Jakob Pertl. I said maybe you should try fading Boucher for Jonte Porter. Well, that didn't come to fruition in that game, but it actually ended up coming to fruition the following game. So yeah, I like Fade and Thaddeus Young for Jonte Porter. And then I don't think anyone else is worth picking up. Chris Boucher is barely getting any minutes, even without Jakob Pertl. So yeah, no one else worth picking up on the Raptors. And that takes us to our next game. You got Miami at Brooklyn. Now for Miami, they play at the slowest pace in the entire league, and they allow the second fewest points per game. And then you got Brooklyn. They play at the sixth slowest pace, and they have an average defense. So this could be a low-scoring, slow-paced game. For Miami, you got no Jaime Jaquez. He just got hurt last night. And then you got Jimmy Butler and Kevin Love are both questionable. Jimmy Butler has missed the past few games. So, normally it wouldn't make that much of a difference if Jimmy Butler ends up missing the game, just because everyone's priced to reflect no Jimmy Butler. Except now you got no Jaime. So that actually, if Jimmy Butler does miss the game, then that does impact things. I think that'll open up things for guys like Caleb Martin and Josh Richardson. Now, if Jimmy does play the game, I think the only guy worth picking up on Miami is probably going to be someone like a Bam Adebayo at $9,200. He's been playing pretty well recently. He's averaging 46.73 over his last 10 games, and he scored 50 plus in 3 out of his last 10 games. So if he gives you 50, he could easily be the top scoring center of the night. So I think Bam's the only guy really worth picking up on the Heat if Jimmy Butler plays. Now, if Jimmy Butler does not play, like I mentioned earlier, I like Josh Richardson. He'll probably end up getting the start. And at $4,600, he'll probably be projected in the mid 20 range. So he'll probably get picked up by the optimizer and obviously be a lot more heavily owned with Jimmy Butler out. And I think maybe you want to consider some Caleb Martin if Jimmy Butler ends up missing the game, especially if Jimmy Butler and Kevin Love end up missing the game. He could end up being the starting power forward and he could give you 30 plus minutes. As far as Tyler Hero, I think $8,000 is a little bit too expensive for him, even if Jimmy Butler ends up missing the game. He hasn't scored a 50-point game in any of his last 10 games. So I'm not crazy about Tyler Hero tonight. Jimmy Butler, if he does play, I don't think $8,100 is really worth it. Maybe you put him in one or two lineups, but I'm not going crazy with him in his first game back for injury if he plays. But he's Jimmy Butler, and he could give you 50 points at $8,100. So maybe you consider him in one or two lineups. Duncan Robinson, he's been hit or miss. He either gives you 30 or he gives you 10. I'm not going to go crazy with him, even if Jimmy Butler ends up missing the game. Maybe you put him in one or two lineups just in case his game is a hit. It's one of those hits tonight, but I'm not going crazy with Duncan. Caleb Martin at $5,400. He hasn't been playing that well in his 2 games back. But if Jimmy Butler ends up missing the game and without Jaime Jaquez, Caleb Martin could play in the mid 30 minutes. And in which case, maybe he's worth picking up in one or two lineups at 5,400 in case he gives you, 35, which he's capable of doing. Kevin Love is questionable. If he ends up playing, I think 5,100 is a little bit too expensive for Kevin Love. If he ends up missing, maybe you consider Jovic, who starts normally and would still start even with Kevin Love out. But Jovic would definitely play more minutes at that power forward spot if Kevin Love ends up missing the game. So at $4,900, maybe you could throw in some Jovic if Kevin Love ends up missing. Otherwise, I don't think Jovic is worth picking up. You got Lowry at $4,700. Maybe you consider him if Jimmy Butler doesn't play, but I'm not going crazy with Lowry. I mean, he's not really playing that many minutes, and he hasn't done much recently. Josh Richardson, like I mentioned earlier, he's worth picking up if if Jimmy Butler ends up missing the game. And that's pretty much it for the Heat. I don't think anyone else is really worth picking it up. And that takes us to Brooklyn. Now, for Brooklyn, the most valuable guy is probably going to be Nick Claxton at $7,500. He's averaging 37 over his last 10 games. So I know he's going against Miami, who's they actually allow the fewest fantasy points to opposing centers. But I think Claxton is kind of a different kind of center where a lot of his fantasy points come from blocks. And I don't think the Heat's defense would necessarily affect a guy like Claxton. So maybe he's worth picking up in a few lineups at that center spot, in case he gives you 40, which he's done 4 times in his last 10 games. And there's not a whole lot of value at center tonight. Now, Mikal Bridges has been kind of hit or miss, and he's kind of been trending down recently. Maybe you put him in 1 or 2 lineups just in case he gives you, 40 again. He had a 48-point game against Brooklyn, or against Portland, rather. You look at that and say, okay, if he gives you 40 tonight at 7,700, maybe he's worth picking up. But I'm not going to go crazy with Bridges, especially against this defense. Then you got Cam Johnson. He's actually a pretty good price at $5,800, and he's coming off an awful game. But I still think $5,800 is a decent price for him. So maybe he's worth picking up in 1 or 2 lineups because in order for him to hit 6x value at $5,800, all he needs to do is score 34.8, which he's done 5 times this season. So I think he's worth picking up in 1 or 2 lineups. Now you got Dinwiddie at $6,300. He's been trending down recently. I mean, look at it. He's been playing awful. 17 points per game in his last 5. Um, Maybe you think this might be the game that he turns it around, but I'm not going crazy with him. Dennis Smith at $5,500. He's another guy who's pretty hit or miss. Um, and I actually think he gets picked up by the optimizer, even though he has pretty bad value. Um, yeah, you see, he does get picked up by the optimizer. So he's a guy I would consider fading because I don't like his value at $5,500. But if he does end up having a big game, then you'll obviously have him in some of your lineups just because the optimizer picks him up. Then you got Cam Thomas at $5,900. He had a big game last game, 39.2. But I'm not going to fall for that trap. I mean, he hasn't done much besides that last game, so I'm not picking up any Cam Thomas. Then you got Dorian Finney-Smith at $4,700. I don't really think he's worth it, and he's not getting the production. Even in games that he plays decent minutes, he still only gives you like in the low 20s, and that's probably not going to cut it. So I'm not crazy about Dorian Finney-Smith. And then I don't really think anyone else is worth picking up on Brooklyn. And that takes us to the next game. You got Indiana at Utah. Now you got Indiana, who allow the third most points per game, and they play at the fastest pace in the entire NBA. And then you got Utah, they allow the eighth most points per game and they play at the eighth fastest pace. Now for Indiana, you got no Halliburton, who's been out the past 3 games. You got Miles Turner at $7,700. I'm not crazy about Miles Turner just because he's been splitting minutes with Jalen Smith. Um, so I really don't think he has that high of a ceiling. I mean, maybe you lock him into 1 or 2 lineups just because there's not a whole lot of value at center tonight. And if he scores 40 plus, which he's capable of, that's pretty decent for a night like tonight. But I'm not going crazy with Miles Turner. TJ McConnell at $6,800. I don't know if he's worth that heavy consideration. He's very productive in the minutes that he plays, but he's not playing that many minutes. I mean, look at this game against Atlanta. He scored 38.8 in 25 minutes. But you know, I don't think that's going to cut it at $6,800. Maybe if he was cheaper, like in the 5,000s, he'd be worth it. But I don't think he's worth it at $6,800. Maybe you lock him into 1 or 2 just in case he gives you one of those, huge TJ McConnell kind of games. But I'm not going crazy with TJ McConnell. But Benedict Mathurin, on the other hand, at $5,700, I like him a lot more. He's $1,100 cheaper. So he's going to be in a bunch of your lineups. But one play I like for tonight is fading Benedict Mathurin for Bruce Brown. So fade Mathurin, lock in Bruce Brown. Bruce Brown's $100 more, but he could easily outscore Benedict Mathurin. And if you look at his last 3 games, he's got 2 40-point games sandwiched with a pretty bad game in between. But if he gives you another 40-plus point game and you fade him and you fade a guy like Mathurin for Bruce Brown, that could end up being a differentiator for tonight. Then you got Andrew Nemhard. He has 2 decent games in his last 2 games. I'm not crazy about him, and I know he gets picked up by the optimizer, but maybe he's a guy you consider fading. If you do pick him up, make sure that you don't have him in the same lineup as TJ McConnell. They're going to be negatively correlated. But yeah, I would consider fading Nemard and also fading Benedict Mathurin and locking in Bruce Brown to a few lineups. Then you got Jalen Smith, who's another guy who gets picked up by the optimizer, even though he's not that valuable, $5,000 and only projected for 23 fantasy points. So that just goes to show you how few value players there are tonight that a guy like him is getting picked up. And he would be another guy I consider fading for some of the other centers I talked about. A guy like Bam Adebayo. And another play I like tonight is locking in Anthony Davis at that center spot, but I'll go over that game later on. And then you got Aaron Nesmith, Buddy Hield. I think they're way too expensive. I don't think they're worth picking up. And I just don't think they have that high of a ceiling. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I don't think anyone else on the Pacers are worth picking up. So let's go ahead and take a look at Utah. Now, for Utah, you got Lauri Markkinen, who's been playing really well recently. He's averaging 48 over his last 5 games, and he's coming off a 56.3 point game against the Lakers. I definitely think he's worth consideration in a few lineups, especially against this really bad defense of Indiana. Then you got Jordan Clarkson and Colin Sexton. I really like playing Sexton without Clarkson because Sexton could easily outscore Clarkson, and he's $600 cheaper. And Sexton has actually outscored Clarkson in his last 2 games. So if you are going to play one of these two guys, I like playing Sexton at $6,700. Maybe you consider one or two lineups with Clarkson in case he gives you 40 plus, which he's done 3 times in the last 10 games. But I'm not going crazy with Clarkson. I like the Sexton play a lot better, especially since that'll be a pretty decent differentiator. I expect Clarkson to be a lot more owned tonight. Then you got John Collins, who's coming off a pretty good game, 48.6 points. At $6,300, if he scores in the 40s again, then he'll definitely end up being in the number one lineup. So I definitely think he's worth consideration. Walker Kessler, on the other hand, I don't think he's worth consideration at $6,100. He's been trending down recently. He's averaging 22 over his last 5 games, and he's coming off an awful game. He played just 13 minutes last game, so I don't think he's worth picking up. Then you got Keontae George and Kelly Olynyk. They're decent fantasy players, but they don't get enough minutes to justify that $5,200 salary. And then Chris Dunn, they've raised his price to $5,300. I think that's too expensive, and there's really no one else worth picking up on Utah. And that takes us to the last game of the night. You got Oklahoma City at the Lakers. Now, Oklahoma City is slightly above average defensively. They allow the 13th fewest points per game, and they play at the sixth fastest pace. And then you got the Lakers, who are average defensively, but they play at the ninth fastest pace. So this could be a pretty fast paced game. You got Shea Gilgis, who, like I mentioned earlier, is questionable. So that will open up a lot of things for a lot of these guys if he ends up missing the game. Now, if he does play, he's definitely worth picking up in a few lineups, as he always is. He could easily be the top scorer overall for the evening. You got Chet Holmgren, who's coming off of back-to-back subpar games, but I think he's worth picking up in a couple of lineups just because, like I mentioned earlier, there's not a lot of centers tonight, and he could end up being the top scoring center of the evening. Now, if Shea Gilgis ends up missing the game tonight, that'll give a slight boost to Chet Holmgren, maybe put him like in the low 40s, like maybe 41 fantasy points. So it really won't affect it that much for a guy like Chet Holmgren. But either way, I think he's worth considering in a couple of lineups on a slate like tonight where there's not a whole lot of value at that center spot. Then you got Jalen Williams, who was on a nice stretch up until last game. But over the last 5 games, he's averaging 39 points per game. I know he's $7,800, which is kind of expensive. Um, Maybe consider him in one or two lineups, even if Shea Gilgis ends up playing, just because he's on a nice stretch. Otherwise, if Shea misses the game tonight, then I think Jalen Williams is definitely worth picking up, and he's probably going to get picked up by the optimizer. Josh Giddey at $7,000. I know he's coming off of a good game 2 games ago. He finished with 51 points in just 22 minutes, and he ended up breaking the slate. But I don't think he's worth picking up just because he's only going to give you minutes in the 20s, and that game right there was an anomaly. I mean, that was a historic blowout. So I don't think Josh Giddey has that high of a ceiling in the low minutes that he plays. Even if Shea Gilgis ends up missing the game, I'm not sure if they're going to give Giddey that many more minutes. Maybe they end up giving him 30 minutes. And if that's the case, then maybe you want to consider him in a couple of lineups. But I'm not going crazy with Giddey. Dort is only really worth consideration if Shea Gilgis ends up missing the game. Otherwise, $5,700 is too expensive for him. And then as far as Isaiah Joe and Kason Wallace, you want to pay attention to which one of those guys ends up starting if Shea Gilgeous ends up missing the game. Otherwise, they're not worth picking up. And that takes us to the Lakers. Now, I definitely think that Anthony Davis is worth picking up in a few lineups, especially locking him into that center spot. I'm going to do that for a few lineups just because he could give you 60 plus easily, and there's no value tonight at that center position. LeBron James ends up getting picked up by the optimizer. I mean, he's $9,800 and he's going against this really bad defense. So I like LeBron James a lot, but maybe you consider fading him for another small forward who's cheaper. And maybe you're concerned a little bit about a blowout if Shea Gilgeous Alexander ends up missing the game tonight. You got Austin Reeves, who's $6,600. So they lowered his price because he's coming off of uh, four bad games in a row, but he's still playing pretty high minutes. And I definitely think he's worth picking up in a few lineups, especially against this Oklahoma City team who play at a really fast pace. This could end up being, a decent bounce back game for Austin Reeves. Then you got D'Angelo Russell, who hasn't done anything up until last game. He dropped 60.6 points. But besides that, I mean, he really hasn't done much. And he's so hit or miss. So I'm not going to go crazy with him. Maybe put him in one or two lineups just in case he has another monster game again. But I'm not going to get too hung up on that last game that he had. Then you got Taurean Prince, who's $5,000. I like Taurean Prince a lot more when he was in the 4,000s, but I think $5,000 is too expensive for him. I mean, he plays decent minutes, but he doesn't really have that much of a production to justify $5,000. So I'm not going to go crazy with Taurean Prince. Now you got Christian Wood, who's very productive in limited minutes. The problem is he's just not playing enough minutes to justify picking him up. I mean, maybe if LeBron happens to miss the game tonight, you pick up Christian Wood. Otherwise, I don't think he's really worth it. And then you got Rui Hachimura, who I talked about earlier as being a sleeper pick. So I like Hachimura in a few lineups as a sleeper. And then there's really no one else worth picking up on the Lakers. But anyways, yeah, that's all the games. Let's go ahead and run one lineup just to see what it spits out. So you got Dennis Smith, Andrew Nemard, Benedict Mathurin, Austin Reeves, RJ Barrett, LeBron James, Thaddeus Young, Anthony Davis, and Jalen Smith. So this is definitely going to change before lock, especially with a lot of those guys questionable. So if you're not already a member for Draft Time, make sure you go ahead and sign up. You can sign up for a free 7-day trial. And good luck to everyone tonight.